to remember is that if you're cutting any time on the water, cutting this skin, I leave them relatively long. My leeches are about 2 inches in length or an inch and a half. If I decide I want to cut this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I bend the material around the blade of the scissors. And by doing this, I'm going to cut. If I cut with it bent around the blade, I then extend a fine point. It's very important. You don't want to come in here flush and flat and then cut it, because this point is very important. We're going thick on the head, tapering thin to the tail on the back end. So again, this is the Mini Leech Jig Radiant, available in the 5 color series. We also have the Mini Leech Jig with black beads, olive, black, and rust bodies. And then the Mayer's Mini Leech, which is the unweighted version. We can now all celebrate and pop open our Snoop Dogg wine, red wine. We're going to attach all of our leftover flies to that cork stopper, and the end result is what we have here. So I appreciate everybody joining today's live event. It's awesome down here. Come down and see us at the Anglers Covey. The fact that Umpqua Feather Merchants is like family to myself and all of us as anglers, being able to travel around to different shows, states, committed to the fly and the design. It's a giant family that we all should be on board with, and if not, you want to definitely look into their patterns. The Titan Tube Midge, 12, 14, and 16, 4 different color combos. We have the Tube Midge, and that's realistic. That's a size 22 on the screen. It's about 3 inches in length. When you see it on the vise, it's going to be very small, so don't sneeze. It could disappear. And last but not least, the Mini Leech Jig Radiant, and that's in orange with the black body to represent the egg-sucking leech. I appreciate everybody's support. Wish you the best this new year. We'll see everybody again soon. Thanks a lot. Yep.
Hello everyone, Pat Dorsey here, Umpqua Signature Fly Designer. Tonight we're going to tie the medallion midge. This fly came about shortly after I invented the top secret midge and uses a very similar abdomen construction, but a much more realistic thorax area. We'll begin. I have a Umpqua 101 clamped into my vise, and I'm going to tie a jam knot out of 8/0 uni thread. As I mentioned, the abdomen is constructed similar to that of the top secret, and we'll take a piece of 6/0 white thread and we'll advance it rearward towards hook bend with symmetrical touching wraps. Once we get back towards the bend, we'll advance the thread forward. Rather than counter ribbing this fly, we're going to actually take this white thread and go in a clockwise rotation with a medium tension. The hardest part about this fly is getting a clean segmented abdomen. With the correct tension and using a new piece of white thread for every fly, that seems to take care of that problem that most fly tyers encounter with the abdomen. The thorax is tied out of material called medallion sheeting. And this is medium dun in color. And we'll advance our thread back to about the 50% point on the hook shank and tie in a piece of medallion sheeting that's about 1/8 inch in diameter. For the wing pad, we'll tie in a separate piece of medallion sheeting, letting it extend up over the other 2 pieces of medallion sheeting that will be used for the wing buds. The thorax is tied out of superfine rust brown. Midge pupa, prior to emergence, they have a robust thorax which contains the wings and the legs of the emerging adult. So we're going to place a nice little ball of dubbing right in that thorax. Looks like a little miniature football. And we'll pull the wing beds forward. Pull the one wing bed forward, take 2 material locking wraps. Pull the front wing bed forward. Take 2 material locking wraps, pull those out of the way, then we'll pull the wing pad over the top. Take 2 material locking wraps. Then we'll snip the materials. We'll pull back the rearward wing bud, front wing bud, and then we'll whip finish. Some patterns are very generic looking, and some patterns are very realistic looking. So when I designed this pattern, I was looking to create a super realistic looking pupa pattern. We'll trim the buds. And then the final step is just to round the buds off, simply taking the scissors and just trimming off the corners. And a good sharp pair of scissors is critical on that. But there you have a completed medallion midge. Truly one of my favorite patterns. Typically when I see that a midge hatch is in progress, I'll typically fish this mid column with a size 6 split shot, just by indicator to about 1.5 times the depth of the current, and just try to keep my fly right in that correct feeding zone. I hope you have as much faith and confidence in the medallion midge as I do over the years. Have fun at the vise. Good evening, everyone. Pat Dorsey here, Umpqua fly designer. Tonight, we're going to tie a Mercury tungsten bead cased caddis. I tied the original Mercury caddis a few years ago, and then recently came out with the tungsten variation to increase the sink rates. It's important to note that this does use a silver lined glass bead, the Mercury bead, which is available in 2 different sizes. A small and an extra small. Most of the patterns that I tie use the extra small, but this uses the small, so that's very important to note. And then the bead is a tungsten bead. This is a 2.5 black bead, but it is turned around backwards, so the countersunk side butts up with the silver lined glass bead. So those are a couple important things here. Hook is a Tiemco 200R, which is a great hook for this type of fly. We'll begin with some 6/0 uni thread jam knot behind the bead. We'll get us a little thread wedge built in there to secure those beads. And one thing that I like to do is just adjust those beads, get them straight before I put some final pressure to lock those beads into place. Then we'll advance the thread back rearward towards hook bend. And we're going to take some hare's mask dubbing. I typically blend my own hare's mask up just so that I can have a lot of guard hairs in the mixture. This pattern typically is going to look a little on the messy side if it's tied well. We'll begin with a little bit of dubbing and we'll start to develop a nice little body. I'm sure you're familiar with cased caddis, and this particular version is a brachiocentrus, which really constitutes the Mother's Day caddis hatch. You've probably hooked a little twig-like looking apparatus on your fly from time to time, and that's actually a brachiocentrus caddis. If you actually squeeze that little twig, you'll see that inside of it is the actual larva. So with this hare's mass dubbing, we're actually pressure to lock those beads into place. Then we'll advance the thread. Develop a nice little body. I'm sure you're familiar with cased caddis, and this particular version is a brachiocentrus, which really constitutes the Mother's Day caddis hatch. You've probably hooked a little twig-like looking apparatus on your fly from time to time, and that's actually a brachiocentrus caddis. If you actually squeeze that little twig, you'll see that inside of it is the actual larva. So with this hare's mass dubbing, we're actually creating the case itself, and it has a nice taper from the bend of the hook up towards the bead. The black bead will simulate the head, and the larva will tie out of some UV chartreuse dubbing. We'll take a little band of chartreuse dubbing. We'll tie it right in behind bead there, and then we'll just take a couple turns there. And a lot of times what I like to do is I'll take some black Sharpie here and color that tan thread black prior to whip finishing. And we'll clip off our thread. So we have the Mercury bead, which highlights that gas bubble effect that takes place during a caddis emergence. We have the tungsten bead to increase the sink rate, and that little band of chartreuse dubbing becomes a trigger and attracts nearby trout. Typically, this is fished mornings and evenings. When behavioral drift occurs, that's when it's really a deadly pattern. But brachiocentrus are really become victims of catastrophic drift as well. So there's really never a bad time to fish this pattern. I hope you enjoy this pattern as much as I have over the years. It's truly one of my favorite attractors for much of the year. One of my favorite times of the year is the high water season. And that's why we're going to tie the UV scud, because it's a must-have during those times of year when the flow is coming up, which typically takes place in May and June on the South Platte and in a lot of your western tail races. A scud is one of those flies that you can't live without. I typically tie them in sizes 12 through 18 in orange, tan, and olive. I've clamped a TM code 2457 into my vise, and we'll begin with a jam knot behind the eye of the hook here. I'm going to tie the orange UV scud this evening. So we're going to use a 6/0 Danville thread and advance the thread back towards hook bend is a little bit of a thread base or underbody, so to speak here. Now this is tied a little different than your traditional fly in the fact that the tail is actually going to be towards the eye of the hook, and the actual front of the scud is going to be towards hook bend. We're going to secure some orange poly right at hook bend, and then we'll advance the thread forward towards the eye of the hook, and then come back and just make sure that's all tied down secure. Leave our thread back at hook bend. I'm going to take a little piece of plastic, a plastic strip that I cut with a razor blade out of actually a Ziploc bag, and I'm going to secure that into place right in front of hook bend. And then the final thing that we should be concerned with is a piece of 4X tippet material for the rib on this pattern. So we'll tie that in once again in the same location as the baggy back. Then we'll take some UV shrimp pink ice dub, and I use olive and tan again in the UV, because if you look at the natural scuds, particularly the olive ones, they have a UV sheen to them. And so you can capture that little bit of UV sheen with this dubbing. So your olive scuds are your living scuds. If you were to seine the river, you would get the olive scuds, the Grimaire scuds, and the dead scuds are orange, and then scuds that are molting are typically tan. So I carry 3 different color schemes of those, again in sizes 12 through 18. We'll put a little bit of this dubbing on now. This dubbing is a little bit trickier to work with in comparison to like fine and dry type dubbings. So don't be too concerned about the dubbing noodle being a little bit thicker than you're accustomed to working with. It's not a problem, because we're going to need to pull this dubbing down for the legs. So I'm going to dub this in a couple different layers, starting at the bend of the hook and then dubbing back towards the eye of the hook. And then what I want to do is try to develop a slight taper from the bend of the hook down towards the eye. If you look at a scud, they're a little bit thicker towards the front end of their bodies in comparison to the rear end of their abdomen. So what I can do here is just build that up, get a slight taper. I'm going to pull the baggy strip over the top. Oh, I got ahead of myself there. I need to pull these legs down. So we're going to take a dubbing brush here and pull down those legs on both sides of the scud. And then I'll use my thumb and my index finger to comb those down. Then I'm going to pull the baggy strip over. Take a couple material locking wraps to hold that into place. Snip off that material, and then I'm going to take my tippet material here. I'm not going to reverse rib this, but I'm going to actually wrap in a clockwise direction. And you got to try to cut through all those fibers. Use your finger to kind of comb those down. And I put a fair amount of tension on that. I want to sink that rib right into that baggy back to create that crustacean look, that segmented effect. And we'll just palmer this tippet material forward. And don't worry about if you get some of that dubbing material trapped in there, because we're going to come back in at the end here and use a bodkin and pull those legs back down. So we'll take a few wraps here, trim off our material there. And then we'll make a nice little head, and we'll whip finish. Trim our thread. I'm going to come in, I'm going to trim the antenna. And then we'll come back and we'll trim the tail. Then I'll typically use my thumb and flare that tail out just a bit. And we'll come back in with our bodkin here, and we'll pull those legs down, the fibers that we trapped when we were ribbing. That's an easy fix. Don't get too worked up, like I said, about it. You can just pull those right out very easily. And then once again, I'm going to pull that down. Then I'm going to trim the fibers straight across with the hook shank, and then from the point of the hook up, I'll trim those fibers off there. So we'll kind of do a couple different cuts there. Give you a look at that top side of it, but you can also see how nicely those legs pull down. Typically use this as my lead fly in a tandem nymphing rig during the high water season, and then I'll trail a couple flies that would match the prevailing hatches at that particular time. Usually we're on the backside of Baetis, but some Baetis are good options at that point in time too, and potentially maybe some caddis that time of year as well. So with the UV scud and those three different colors is one of my top guide flies, no doubt, and especially in that high water season in May and June. We're on the backside of the spawn, so a lot of times trout are still looking for eggs, and the trout spawn really late in Cheeseman because the water is so cold. So it's not uncommon to see rainbows on reds clear into the end of June. So they'll eat this as an egg pattern sometimes, but they'll also eat it as a scud. So it's a very, very versatile fly for that particular time of year. So you should tie a few of these up. I think you'll be happy you did. It's one of those patterns that when fish get on scuds, they really look for them because it's a very high protein diet.